Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another fun week of Thrive Live. Today, we are going to talk all about the vaginal microbiome and why it's so important and how we can support it. So let's first talk about sexual health. So the vaginal microbiome, of course, is very important for preventing those recurrent vaginal infections, yeast infections, recurrent BV, any other type of STDs, basically. When we have a healthy vaginal microbiome, it's very resilient and resistant to a lot of stuff. Commonly we will see, yeast infections getting passed and forth between the two partners. And yes, you want to go in and give antifungals and to treat it, but you also want to focus on building up that vaginal biome, which we'll get into. The biome here is also extremely important for fertility, which actually doesn't really get a lot of talk time, a lot of press, but is actually incredibly important. We'll actually go into how the biome differs throughout the whole genital tract for women. But basically the biome actually really can affect implantation and fertility rates. So our normal pH, because this is another big question I get a lot, is the normal pH to the vagina is 3.5 to 4.5. And when we get out of this, if we get either acidic or too alkaline, that's when we're going to start to see the recurrent BV, the recurrent yeast, other type of infections kind of thriving in the imbalanced pH. Now, as a side note, sex and menstrual fluids, so semen and menstrual fluids, actually neutralize the pH for a shorter a period of time, basically. So that's also one of the reasons why sometimes you can feel like you get more recurrent yeast infections or BV after sex or after your menstrual cycle. We also know, just going back to the menstrual cycle, that estrogen and progesterone, as they are changing throughout your cycle, are also going to be changing your vaginal biome. So your vaginal biome actually changes as your hormones change and as your hormones fluctuate. And we know that because of this hormone fluctuation, that actually women have a different vaginal biome during their menstrual years, when they hit perimenopause, when they finally hit menopause. So that biome changes with your hormones. Now, let's talk about the vaginal biome and this greater ecosystem, because this is really, really important for creating a vital vagina, right? For creating a very robust vaginal biome that's going to be resistant to yeast infections, STDs, HPV. And so when we talk in integrative medicine with a lot of these infections, like we talked about SIBO last week, this was a big topic that we had talked on. It's not just about killing stuff. It's actually about building up this stronger ecosystem, because we have a healthier ecosystem, then the right bacteria can grow there. It's like organic farming, right? You can't grow these nice organic vegetable crops if you have sick soil. We need to make a healthy soil. So lactobacilli, traditionally, we thought has been the predominant bacteria, and we'll actually get into how that even changes genetically and based on nationality. But lactobacilli basically produce lactic acid, which effectively acidifies the vaginal vaults and actually produces antimicrobial compounds, and these will they're like targeted specific antibiotics. They also release hydrogen peroxide. Hydrogen peroxide again also maintains the pH of that vaginal vault. And so the hydrogen peroxide, the lactic acid, they're also protecting this vaginal vault from HIV, gonorrhea, and it also stimulates the host immune system, defense system, and it kind of regulates the local immunity there. So the lactobacilli is not just about bacteria, it's actually what that bacteria is producing, what it produces is actually maintaining that ecosystem, which is why we'll use hydrogen peroxide vaginal douches to treat recurrent BV, right? We're trying to actually regenerate that ecosystem so that the lactobacilli can take over. And this is an effect by boric acid is useful. I mean, it's useful because it is also antifungal, but also helps that pH in that ecosystem component. And so this I find fascinating. So for years, I feel like in medicine, we have thought that lactobacilli is the dominant species in the vaginal vault. Now, there's a lot of subspecies to the lactobacilli. So in Caucasians and Asian populations, Lactobacilli crispatus is the most dominant species, and Lactobacillus crispatus is the lactobacilli strain that we know creates this really healthy vaginal vault, this healthy resistant, I'll say infectious resistance vaginal biome. But in African American and Hispanic populations, we see Lactobacilli gengensi and also non-lactobacilli species are dominant. And these are healthy vaginal vaults. So this is actually kind of new data coming out, relatively new data, and kind of changing how we think about the vaginal vault, where what we thought has always been lactobacilli. Well, in African Americans and Hispanics, they do have the Lactobacilli gengensi, but Lactobacilli crispatus is actually on the smaller side, and they'll have the non-lactobacilli species that's dominant, and these are healthy biomes. So what causes this is genetics, maybe there's some food at play. I think we're still figuring out what is driving that differentiation in species based on ethnicity. But in regards to how much variation there is, so there's over 50 species of lactobacilli identified in the vaginal vault. And for comparison, there's over 800 species of lactobacilli identified in the gut. So a ton of variation in here. The four most common types of lactobacilli that we will see in the vaginal vault is Lactobacillus crispatus, which is the one that we've always thought is the most dominant. We know that one creates the most, well, I'm pausing because I've even changed my own thought process here, but the Lactobacilli crispatus actually creates the most disease-resistant biome, right? The most anti-HPV, the most anti-yeast type of an ecosystem. There's Lactobacilli inners and Lactobacilli gasseri, which historically I've also been trained and thought, okay, well, these are, well, the Lactobacilli is good, but these are less good Lactobacilli strains to be there. When you're more vaginally dominant in these strains, we don't see as strong of a vaginal vault that is in terms of resistance to HPV, HIV, yeast. And then there's, of course, the Lactobacilli gengensi. Now, why I was pausing in that statement is I think we still have a lot more to learn here medically, just because there is, going back, and there is that big variation in ethnic groups in terms of what type of bacterial strain is dominant, and these are healthy vaginal vaults. So at the end of the day, I actually think that testing is really, really important, especially when we're looking at fertility and you're looking, and if you are susceptible to any type of chronic vaginal infections, testing can be really, really important. There's one company that I use to test, MDL. They do a vaginal swab. They'll actually do testing of these lactobacilli subspecies. So we can do this for fertility prep, early pregnancy, basically anytime that we want to know. And it doesn't have to be done for fertility, but fertility is actually really big. And the reason why vaginal biome is big, there's actually an IVF study, and that we know that women with abnormal vaginal microbiota are 1.4 times less likely to have a successful early pregnancy development after IVF. And So basically the vaginal biome testing should be done very early for fertility. And in my opinion, with the IVF, I generally don't see it done. So I'm always adding it on. And also potentially considering vaginal lactobacilli early in the cycle, pre-embryo transfer, to help with the implantation. So what affects our vaginal microbiome, right? We just went into and explained what is there. It's very vast, right? Over 50 species of lactobacilli are in the vaginal vault. So what's affecting it? So while the gut is a distinctly different ecosystem, the gut is the host microbiome to the vaginal and the urinary systems. And I've seen this clinically all the time. When it comes to treating recurrent yeast infections, recurrent UTIs, recurrent BV, yes, treat the local ecosystem, but we have to look at the greater digestive ecosystem. Now, beyond the gut, number one, diet definitely makes the biggest impact on the gut microbiome. We got genetics, we have environmental. So the environment accounts for about 25 to 30% of microbiome variability. So temperature, heavy metals, toxins, xenobiotic exposure, and xenobiotics are those environmental estrogens like plastics. The xenobiotics are a huge driver in a lot of biome changes in the body, and they sneak in lotions, makeups, the cosmetics that we're using, shampoos, conditioners. Are we drinking in plastic? Or are we going to be drinking in stainless steel? Are we storing food in plastic? Plastic is a big one, the xenoestrogens. And so all these things can basically disrupt the pH, the susceptibility of our biome to pathogens, immune function, and they all kind of dance together. Sorry, got a call coming in from my husband. Okay, it's fine. So in utero, so in the uterus, we know that the microbiome can have just as much of an impact as the egg and the sperm on embryogenetics. I think, again, there's a lot more research that's going to be coming out in this realm, but I bring this up from the aspect, it's not just about the bacteria from an aspect of frequent BV and yeast infections. The bacteria are actually affecting how our genes are turning on and off. It's crazy, right? I think there's kind of a joke that me and my colleagues talk about where, what is our purpose on this world and this planet? It can be very altruistic, or it can be just to carry around all this bacteria that we're carrying around. Because if the bacteria are responsible for turning on our genetic pathways, at least for partly turning on genetic pathways, then they're driving a lot of action in the body, right? And so if you think even of autoimmune disease, bacteria and the biome that we have in our bodies actually can be a trigger for triggering autoimmune activation. So the biome in your uterus and the biome in the vagina are very important, not just on this localized ecology standpoint. Now, estrogen is a big influencer of the bacteria in the vaginal vault. Estrogen actually increases the adherence of the lactobacilli to the epithelium. So that means basically that estrogen makes the lactobacilli stick to our uterus and vaginal linings better, right? So this is, I think, a big reason why hormone replacement therapy in menopause, so that estrogen actually restores that vaginal lactobacilli state. So that's why it can be helpful for recurrent urinary tract infections, recurrent yeast infections with vaginal estrogen specifically. And again, going back when we first talked about in the beginning of this talk about how our hormones, estrogen and progesterone, are affecting our vaginal, uterus, ovarian biomes. And I want to share one slide here. So I think this is just a great slide. I took it from one of my continuing education lectures. Dr. Jacqueline Chase put the slide together. But in terms of a kind of a quick takeaway of things that disrupt the vaginal and gut biome. So let's go into the agitators. So fats, artificial sweeteners, and travel will disrupt your gut biome. what disrupts some of the vaginal microbiome, contraceptives, perfumed soaps, sex, tight clothing, your menstrual cycle, aging, pregnancy. We also know sugar, certain medications, stress, and more of the unhealthy diet. What supports your vaginal microbiome is cotton underwear, good hygiene, staying really well hydrated, a healthy diet, exercise, culturelle, other probiotics. And in the gut, fiber, mindful meditation. So I thought that was a kind of a fun slide. So you can just pause this and look at that if you want to look at it again. Okay. So let's dig more into the estrobilome. So estrobilome is the concept that we basically have bacteria poop increasing our estrogen recirculation in the body. That's the big takeaway. So in a healthy microbiome, the liver and the gut excrete most estrogens with minimal reabsorption back into the body. In an imbalanced biome, we see that this imbalance in the gut bacteria, they actually produce beta-glucuronidase, and you'll see this on a lot of gut tests. They'll be tracking beta-glucuronidase. And that is basically, beta-glucuronidase is basically bacteria poop. Think about it that way. And this increases the estrogen reabsorption back in the body. So you're actually pooping out lower amounts of estrogen. The takeaway is, as you have this increased estrogen going up, it increases PMS, breast tenderness, cancer, estrogen-driven cancer risks. So your gut flora dramatically affects your estrogen balance. How do you treat it? Get 50 unique plants each week. So fiber, 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 and improve that gut biome if that's not doing it. Let's talk about the uterus. The uterus is in fact not sterile. And there's different biome populations in the ovaries, and the ovaries are very microbial diverse. The fallopian tubes, the endometrium, and the endometrium is actually still mostly lactobacilli dominant. And then of course the vagina, which we went into in terms of the bacterial populations. And so we know that there are disease states, so endometriosis, polyps that can be associated with endometrial microbiome imbalance. We know that this bacterial imbalance can be linked with cancer propagation. I'm not going to give you cancer, but it can propagate it more with cervical, endometrial, and ovarian cancers. And how does it do this? So basically, imbalance in the local bacteria can lead to local inflammation, altering that immune response, because remember, the bacteria are responsible for actually affecting our localized immune response and then affecting metabolic cell signaling. So basically, the bacteria affect how our immune system is functioning locally, which is why we can see this propagation of cancers increase with dysbiosis in whatever area. Let's talk quickly about implantation, because we're in the category of uterus right now. Implantation of the embryo of the egg requires healthy microbiome. We know that Bacteroides dominance, actually we see improved implantation rates, lactobacilli dominant, we see better pregnancy outcomes. And with IVF, we see that lactobacillus is associated with better embryo maturation and successful transfer. So take away, the biome of the vagina, the biome of the uterus, and the ovaries play a huge role in fertility and IVF success rates. And I've heard of actually a couple IVF doctors talking about this, but it's not yet commonly talked about, and I'm going to be excited for the day when it's commonly talked about. Quick dive into pregnancy. I could do a whole lecture on that, but pregnancy and the microbiome, there is, as our hormones shift, there is a shift in the microbiome. During pregnancy, the gut microbiome has a dramatic shift that actually resembles metabolic syndrome. So more insulin desensitization, right? Metabolic syndrome, think obesity. And in the vagina, we know that if vaginal dominance of the Lactobacilli crispatus subspecies actually is more predictive of a competent cervix and a full-term delivery. And cool thing, so all the ladies out there with group B strep during pregnancy, the conventional treatment is antibiotics, you still have it, you know, at delivery. But if it's caught early enough, you can actually treat it with Lactobacillus rhamnosus and reuteri. But you have to be consistent with it and take like a medication, don't skip days, and it has to be treated early, caught early enough. So that is a potential way that we can actually take GBS and flag it positive. So to avoid the onslaught of the IV and oral antibiotics at delivery. So testing, test. Medical diagnostic labs, MDL does the vaginal swab that does the lactobacilli subtyping. I've seen it. They are great. They do clinically, you know, they are really on point with their testing. So let's talk about how we can support the vaginal microbiome. So in general, because the biome is so important, rotate and pulse different probiotics, right? Rotate between 4 to 5 different types of, there's usually a reasoning and a good reasoning to give them. I generally love the Lactobacilli, reuteri, and rhamnosus for any type of chronic UTIs or vaginitis, yeast infections, BV. I do see that over time, it's gentle, it takes a while, but they actually do bring in that normalcy. Diet and lifestyle. So fiber density is huge, and a high fiber diet and high fiber in the diet. So eating a lot of variety of plant fibers. So anything that is a plant counts in this. We want to be eating the rainbow, getting as much of that variety as possible, not just focusing on one fiber, because that variety actually, that's prebiotics, and they're going to feed bacteria. So the more variety we have nutritionally, the more diverse biome we get. Stress reduction. This can be a tricky one because it's hard to ask our brains if we're stressed, because our brain can only compare it to itself. It's always kind of a funny question. Like, we know if we're stressed if it's really, really big, but from a chronic, like a chronicity standpoint to stress, I think that's a harder question to ask in regards to how our body processes just day-to-day stress. Do we hold tension somewhere? But we do know stress has a huge impact on biome, not just digestion, also vaginally, uterus, and elsewhere in the body. Avoiding the disruptors as much as possible. Sometimes you need the antibiotics and you got to take them, but antibiotics will definitely be a disruptor. I mean, who isn't seeing like the rebound yeast infection, vaginal yeast infection post oral antibiotics, right? It's because it's a huge disruptor to that system. I mean, again, sometimes you need the antibiotics. If you have to take it, I usually say a high dose probiotic, at least an hour away from the antibiotics, and you start hitting that really hard, continue for a couple of weeks afterwards. And again, you can refer back to that disruptor slide if you need to. And fermented foods, you know, it's a natural source of prebiotic foods. So fermented foods are great. Kimchi, sauerkraut. Those are just a great way to bring in the probiotics and the prebiotics. Addressing your internal pH. So your internal pH is going to affect your vaginal pH, right? So what we see, what improves this internal pH is more a vegetarian style diet, meaning eat more veggies, get more of those plant fibers. You can see the trend going on in the diet arena. Electrolytes, actually drinking electrolytes can help the internal pH, which will in effect help improving your internal pH will effectively help the vaginal pH. First, I just have to say, I just realized that I have my Zoom settings not set up correctly for this because people have been trying to get into the waiting room. I'm sorry. I will fix that going forward. And then avoiding sugar. Sugar derives any bacterial dysbiosis. Avoiding yeast. Kombucha is a yeast drink, and kombucha, if given in a state when you have mold or yeast dominance, will drive that. Alcohol converts to sugar easily and will feed that imbalance, and caffeine will actually change your biome as well. And for those just came in, I'm sorry, I did not realize that this link was putting everyone into my waiting room. So I will fix that for next week moving forward. I did not realize that that was happening. So I just got through the talk. So for those that actually just came on, let me know if you have any burning questions, just put it into the chat and I can make sure that I answer them. But takeaways, what we do to our gut, what we do to our internal pH, what we do environmentally, will, and hormonally, will all affect our biome in the vagina, uterus, ovaries, fallopian tube, gut, and it is all greater. It all connected as a greater thing. So I'll hang out here for a couple more minutes. And again, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that people were being brought into my waiting room. I will fix that for next week moving forward. I'm used to Zoom just bringing people in for the Thrive Live things, and I changed the Zoom link for this week, which is why that whole issue was happening. All right, I don't see any questions coming in, so we will call it. I hope this was very helpful and useful. Next week, we actually have Dr. Allison Immel coming on. She is going to be talking all about pelvic floor, and she is a wonderful speaker. I've had her on before, and she is extremely knowledgeable. So we'll be excited to hear from her, and we'll see you next week.